Hi guys, it's Gib here, and welcome to episode 3 of me learning C++ game development by remaking Crash Bandicoot. So in the previous 2 episodes we added Crash, we added some basic collectibles, but to be honest it still feels like there's something missing. There's not really a challenge and there's nothing really stopping Crash from just running to the end. So we got to change that, and this week, you guessed it, we're adding enemies to our game. So in this week's video we're going to add enemies to the game, we're going to give those enemies some basic properties, and we're going to add them to the game world so that it can make the game a bit more exciting. Really the objective of this video is to show how even as a total beginner you can add some cool enemy features to your game. So I'll take you through a step-by-step of my thought process and how I implemented each feature, and also end the video with some common pitfalls that I found and spent a lot of time on, so that hopefully you won't encounter the same issues when you go to add enemies to your game. With all that being said, let's dive right in. So the first decision we need to make is what enemies do we want to add to the game. Crash Bandicoot has a lot of quite complex enemies there, which are, I'm sure, really fun to make. However, I'm a beginner, I need to set realistic targets, so I'll aim for some simple ones. With that in mind, I chose to implement the following 3 enemy types. The rat/badger thing, the plants, and the rollers in the level. One thing I'd always recommend to a beginner is starting out with a project plan. So as usual, I used Milanote and I plotted out exactly what I wanted to build for each of those enemy types. Based on that, I set the following requirements of building a basic model for the enemy, setting some basic mechanics which were found in the game, and also allowing the enemy to spawn and attack the player. When looking at the badgers and plants from the game, it seems that they share a couple of common properties, which I'll set as base requirements for both of them. Firstly, they both spawn when Crash passes a certain point, and also they are able to deal damage to Crash, and we are able to deal damage to them. As a result of this, I took the following approach to implementing these enemy types. Each enemy actor would have a spawn trigger, and basically the enemy wouldn't be visible until Crash interacted or overlapped with that trigger. And when the enemy actor becomes visible, there'd be a secondary trigger which is attached to the mesh of the actor, and this would be used to help determine whether or not the actor has been destroyed or whether or not damage has been dealt to Crash. For the spawn trigger, it wasn't too tricky. Basically, the actor was hidden in the game until an overlap event occurred. I actually made the choice here to hide the actor versus spawning them every time they interacted with the trigger, mainly because in the game, if you don't interact with the enemy and leave the spawn area, they disappear, and then they reappear when you re-enter the spawn area. This was way easier to do with the hiding and unhiding method. The enemy trigger itself was actually a lot easier to implement, and obviously worked first time without any problems. Lol. Jokes aside, this worked really similarly to the box triggers that we'd already built for the crates and collectibles. How I implemented this was to check whether or not Crash was spinning whilst overlapping with the enemy trigger, and if Crash was, then the enemy actor would be destroyed from the world. Otherwise, I would simulate Crash losing a life or actually losing an Aku if he had an Aku mask. And with those 2 triggers built, this is what it looked like at the end of day 1. I was really happy with this. It seemed to work pretty quickly, and of course, what we need to do next is change these really accurate models of the enemies to proper models. Now, I know these are already top tier models, but I think we should change it to something a bit more realistic. As a beginner, I always suggest going to a website like Sketchfab. It takes all the pressure on you having to model things yourself, and it has an amazing array of free models that you can use. Firstly, I started getting the plant model, and I found an absolutely amazing model that was already there. It had animations as well, which was absolutely amazing. So as our hero Danny would say, "Thanks, Jacqueline, very cool." As you can see, this needed a bit of tweaking in the game world, but overall worked really well. I got the animations working using animation blueprints, and yeah, really great. Didn't have to do too much. The badger, on the other hand, that was a completely different story. Anyway, I managed to find a pretty decent badger model. Seems a bit scary, those eyes are a bit crazy, but it worked anyway. Now this one didn't have animations, which meant I had to do rigging and everything in Maya, so yeah, what follows is an absolute disaster of an animation from me. So moral of the story here is that rigging is really, really freaking hard, especially if you're trying to model animals or creatures. I got this really, really janky walk model. He's not even really walking, but it'll do as a beginner model. So this is what I was left with in the end. As you can see, I think they had some pretty big glow-ups, these guys. I was pretty happy overall. Now I wanted to move on to adding some properties for them. In the game, the enemies have a couple of properties which I wanted to emulate in my version. Firstly, when the badger enemies spawn, they actually follow Crash and move towards him. The second and final property that I wanted to implement was the badger enemy spawning multiple times until Crash passes a certain point. To tackle the movement requirement, I actually attached an AI controller to the badger enemy. And from there, the process is actually pretty simple. Basically, within the controller class in Unreal, there is a built-in method called move to actor. And actually this does exactly what we want, because this moves the controlled pawn to an actor of our choosing. In this case, it would be our Crash character. The only thing that you need to do to make this work, however, is just make sure that you set up a nav mesh volume within your game world. And this basically tells the pawn, well, these are the areas that you can walk and these are the areas that you can't walk. And now with that working absolutely perfectly, I wanted to move on to the second requirement.
What is that?
Now this requirement I thought was going to be easy, and it actually ended up taking me a day to implement. And in the end, I managed to get it working by using some hacky timer functions in Unreal, and also spawning based on the number of enemies that were counted in the game. And honestly, even though this solution is terrible and I don't know why it works, I was really happy that I got it working. This was probably the biggest challenge I'd faced whilst doing the project so far, and yeah, I managed to do it, so really happy. The last and final thing I wanted to do was add these little roller enemies to the game. And actually for this one, I decided to try and model it out myself in Maya because it looked simple enough. That went pretty okay. This was the result, and I also tried to do basic animation cycle for it as well. For this, I just set keyframes for the position and the rotation to make it look like it was moving smoothly across the track, as a stone would. And the final thing you need to do to get this in the game world is to import that into Unreal, and make sure that you create a blueprint child class from the C++ class. In this case, it is an enemy character technically, even though it's not really a character, and it inherits a lot of the components that we've already built. And this is the final result. So I'm well aware that it looks a little bit like a donut rather than an ancient roller, but it works pretty well for providing a challenge to the game. It takes life off Crash when Crash interacts with it, and because they're blueprint children, you can just add instances of this all over the world, and it's easy to place throughout the level. So this is where I got to for the end of this week, folks. I really enjoyed this week. I felt like I learnt a lot adding enemies to the games. I explored a lot of new concepts, and I was able to overcome some challenges which I definitely wouldn't have been able to do a couple of weeks ago. I'm about a month into my programming journey now, and as you can see, there's a huge difference from the start of the game where I didn't really know anything. So yeah, I'm really proud of what the game looks like, and I'm looking forward to adding more features to it. As I discussed at the start of the video, here on screen is a couple of common pitfalls that I found which really took me a long time to figure out. I'm going to be creating a longer video describing each of them in detail, but of course if you've got any questions, then please ask in the chat, and I'll definitely be monitoring and happy to provide any more answers that anyone may need. Thanks again folks for watching. I really appreciate the support. Last week's video did really well. Every comment is really great. If you like the videos and want to see more, please like, subscribe and comment. And as always folks, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.